She switched off the tangerine radio. In the afternoon silence, laced with edges of light, her children curled into the warmth of her, the smell of her. They covered their heads with her hair. They sensed somehow that in her sleep she had traveled away from them. They summoned her back now, with the palms of their small hands laid flat against the bare skin of her midriff. "Here's where we kicked you." Esther traced a wandering silver stretch mark with his finger. "That's Esther's kick, and that's mine," Rahel said. "And that's Esther's, and that's mine." Between them they apportioned their mother's 7 silver stretch marks. Then Rahel put her mouth on Amu's stomach and sucked at it, pulling the soft flesh into her mouth and drawing her head back to admire the shining oval of spit and the faint red imprint of her teeth on her mother's skin. Amu wondered at the transparency of that kiss. It was a clear-as-glass kiss, unclouded by passion or desire, that pair of dogs that sleep so soundly inside children, waiting for them to grow up. It was a kiss that demanded no kiss back. Not a cloudy kiss full of questions that wanted answers, like the kisses of cheerful one-armed men in dreams. Amu grew tired of their proprietary handling of her. She wanted her body back. It was hers. She shrugged her children off the way a bitch shrugs off her pups when she's had enough of them. She sat up and twisted her hair into a knot at the nape of her neck. Slanting afternoon light flooded the room and brightened 2 children on the bed. The twins heard the lock turning in Amu's bathroom door. Amu undressed and put a red toothbrush under her breast to see if it would stay. It didn't. Where she touched herself, her flesh was taut and smooth. She undid her hair and turned around to see how long it had grown. It fell in waves and curls and disobedient frizzy wisps, soft on the inside, coarser on the outside, to just below where her small, strong waist began its curve out towards her hips. She looked a little critically at her round, heavy behind. Big only because the rest of her was so slender. It belonged on another more voluptuous body. She had to admit that they would happily support a toothbrush apiece, perhaps 2. She laughed out loud at the idea of walking naked down a Yemenem with an array of colored toothbrushes sticking out from either cheek of her bottom. She silenced herself quickly. She saw a wisp of madness escape from its bottle and caper triumphantly around the bathroom. Amu worried about madness. Mamachi said it ran in their family. Would future generations say, there was Amu Ipe, married a Bengali, went quite mad, died young, in a cheap lodge somewhere? Amu gathered up her heavy hair, wrapped it around her face, and peered down the road to age and death through its parted strands. It wasn't what lay at the end of her road that frightened Amu, as much as the nature of the road itself. No milestones marked its progress. No trees grew along it. No twists, no turns, or hairpin bends obscured even momentarily her clear view of the end. This filled Amu with an awful dread, because she was not the kind of woman who wanted her future told. So if she were granted one small wish, perhaps it would only have been not to know. Not to know what each day held in store for her. Not to know which way her road might turn and what lay beyond the bend. And Amu knew, or thought she knew, which was really just as bad, because if in a dream you've eaten fish, it means you've eaten fish. And what Amu knew, or thought she knew, smelled of the vapid, vinegary fumes that rose from the cement vats of paradise pickles, fumes that wrinkled youth and pickled futures. Hooded in her own hair, Amu leaned against herself in the bathroom mirror and tried to weep. For herself, for the god of small things, for the sugar-dusted twin midwives of her dream. That afternoon, while in the bathroom, the fates conspired to horribly alter the course of their mysterious mother's road. While in Veluta's backyard, an old boat waited for them, while in a yellow church a young bat waited to be born. In their mother's bedroom, Esther stood on his head, on Rahel's bum. The bedroom, with blue curtains and yellow wasps that worried the window panes. The bedroom whose walls would soon learn their harrowing secrets. The bedroom into which Amu would first be locked and then lock herself, whose door Chaco, crazed by grief, 4 days after Sophie Moll's funeral, would batter down. "Get out of my house before I break every bone in your body. My house, my pineapples, my pickle." After that, for years, Rahel would dream this dream. A fat man, faceless, kneeling beside a woman's corpse, breaking every bone in its body. And Rahel, though years later in the electric crematorium, she would use the slipperiness of sweat to slither out of Chaco's grasp, loved them both, the killer and the corpse. As the door was slowly battered down, to control the trembling of her hands, Amu would hem the ends of Rahel's ribbons that didn't need hemming. "Promise me you'll always love each other," she'd say, as she drew her children to her. "Promise," Esther and Rahel would say, not finding words with which to tell her that for them there was no each, no other. Twin millstones and their mother. Numb millstones. What they had done would return to empty them, but that would be later. Later. A deep-sounding bell in a mossy well, shivery and furred like moth's feet. "Pack your things and go," Chaco would say, stepping over the debris, looming over them, a chrome door handle in his hand, suddenly strangely calm, surprised at his own strength, his bigness, his bullying power, the enormity of his own terrible grief. Amu, quiet outside, shaking inside, wouldn't look up from her unnecessary hemming. The tin of colored ribbons would lie open on her lap, in the room where she had lost her locust's stand-eye. The same room in which, after the twin expert from Hyderabad had replied, Amu would pack Esther's little trunk and khaki hold-all. 12 sleeveless cotton vests, 12 half-sleeved cotton vests. "Esther, here's your name on them in ink." His socks, his drain-pipe trousers, his pointy-collared shirts, his beige and pointy shoes, from where the angry feelings came, his Elvis records, his calcium tablets and Vitolin syrup, his free giraffe that came with the Vitolin, his books of knowledge, volumes 1 to 4. "No, sweetheart, there won't be a river there to fish in." His white leather zip-up Bible with an imperial entomologist's amethyst cufflink on the zip, his mug, his soap, his advance birthday present that he mustn't open. The sharp edge of his apprehensions, blunted by this sudden wealth of worldly possessions. They were his, and had his name on them in ink. They were to be packed into the trunk, with his name on it, that lay open on the bedroom floor. The room to which, years later, Rahel would return and watch a silent stranger bathe, and wash his clothes with crumbling bright blue soap. Flat-muscled and honey-colored, sea secrets in his eyes, a silver raindrop on his ear. "Esta papi chachen, kutapen Peterman." The sound of the chenda mushroomed over the temple, accentuating the silence of the encompassing night. Inside, everything was white-walled, moss-tiled, and moonlit. Everything smelt of recent rain. The thin priest was asleep on a mat on the raised stone veranda. A brass platter of coins lay near his pillow like a comic strip illustration of his dreams. The compound was littered with moons, one in each mud puddle. Kochutomban had finished his ceremonial rounds and lay tethered to a wooden stake next to a steaming mound of his own dung. He was asleep, his duty done, his bowels empty. One tusk resting on the earth, the other pointed to the stars. Rahel approached quietly. she saw that his skin was looser than she remembered. He wasn't Kochu Tomban anymore. His tusks had grown. He was Velya Tomban now, the big tusker. She put the coconut on the ground next to him. A leathery wrinkle parted to reveal a liquid glint of elephant eye. Then it closed, and long, sweeping lashes resummoned sleep, a tusk towards the stars. June is low season for Kathakali, but there are some temples that a troupe will not pass by without performing in. The Ayamanem temple wasn't one of them, but these days, thanks to its geography, things had changed. In Ayamanem, they danced to jettison their humiliation in the heart of darkness. Their truncated swimming pool performances, their turning to tourism to stave off starvation. On their way back from the heart of darkness, they stopped at the temple to ask pardon of their gods, to apologize for corrupting their stories, for incashing their identities, misappropriating their lives. On these occasions, a human audience was welcome, but entirely incidental. In the broad covered corridor, the colonnaded Kutambalam, abutting the heart of the temple where the blue god lived with his flute, the drummers drummed and the dancers danced, their colors turning slowly in the night. Rahel sat down cross-legged, resting her back against the roundness of a white pillar. It didn't matter that the story had begun, because Kathakali discovered long ago that the secret of the great stories is that they have no secrets. The great stories are the ones you have heard and want to hear again, the ones you can enter anywhere and inhabit comfortably. They are as familiar as the house you live in, or the smell of your lover's skin. You know how they end, yet you listen as though you don't, in the way that although you know that one day you will die, you live as though you won't. In the great stories, you know who lives, who dies, who finds love, who doesn't, and yet you want to know again. That is their mystery and their magic. Rahel, no plans, no locus standi, her back against a pillar, watched Karna praying on the banks of the Ganga. Karna, sheathed in his armor of light. Karna, melancholy son of Surya, god of day. Karna, the abandoned child. Karna, the most revered warrior of them all. That night, Karna was stoned. His tattered skirt was darned. His velvet blouse had grown bald with use. His heels were cracked, tough. He stubbed his joints out on them. This man tonight is dangerous, his despair complete. This story is the safety net above which he swoops and dives like a brilliant clown in a bankrupt circus. It is the vessel into which he pours himself. It gives him shape, structure. It harnesses him. It contains him, his love, his madness, his hope, his infinite joy. Ironically, his struggle is the reverse of an actor's struggle. He strives not to enter a part, but to escape it. But this is what he cannot do. In his abject defeat lies his supreme triumph. He is Karna, whom the world has abandoned. Karna alone. Condemned goods, a prince raised in poverty, born to die unfairly, unarmed, and alone at the hands of his brother, majestic in his complete despair. Then Kunti appeared. She too was a man, but a man grown soft and womanly, a man with breasts from doing female parts for years. Her movements were fluid, full of woman. She had come to tell Karna a story. Karna inclined his beautiful head and listened. Red-eyed, Kunti danced for him. She told him of a young woman who had been granted a boon, a secret mantra that she could use to choose a lover from among the gods. Of how, with the imprudence of youth, the woman decided to test it to see if it really worked. How she stood alone in an empty field, turned her face to the heavens, and recited the mantra. The words had scarcely left her foolish lips, Kunti said, when Surya, the god of day, appeared before her. The young woman, bewitched by the beauty of the shimmering young god, gave herself to him. 9 months later, she bore him a son. The baby was born sheathed in light, with gold earrings in his ears and a gold breastplate on his chest, engraved with the emblem of the sun. The young mother loved her firstborn son deeply, Kunti said, but she was unmarried and couldn't keep him. She put him in a reed basket and cast him away in a river. The child was found downriver by Adiratha, a charioteer, and named Karna. Karna looked up at Kunti. Who was she? Who was my mother? Tell me where she is. Take me to her. Kunti bowed her head. She's here, she said, standing before you. Karna's elation and anger at the revelation, his dance of confusion and despair. Where were you, he asked her, when I needed you most? Did you ever hold me in your arms? Did you feed me? Did you ever look for me? Did you wonder where I might be? In reply, Kunti took the regal face in her hands, greened the face, red the eyes, and kissed him on his brow. Karna shuddered in delight, a warrior reduced to infancy. The ecstasy of that kiss, he dispatched it to the ends of his body, to his toes, his fingertips, his lovely mother's kiss. Did you know how much I missed you? Rahel could see it coursing through his veins, as clearly as an egg traveling down an ostrich's neck. A traveling kiss, whose journey was cut short by dismay, when Karna realized that his mother had revealed herself to him only to secure the safety of her 5 other, more beloved sons, the Pandavas, poised on the brink of their epic battle with their 100 cousins. It is them that Kunti sought to protect by announcing to Karna that she was his mother. She had a promise to extract. She invoked the love laws. They are your brothers, your own flesh and blood. Promise me you will not go to war against them. Promise me that. Karna the warrior could not make that promise, for if he did, he would have to revoke another one. Tomorrow he would go to war, and his enemies would be the Pandavas. They were the ones, Arjuna in particular, who had publicly reviled him for being a lowly charioteer's son. And it was Duryodhana, the eldest of the 100 Kaurava brothers, that came to his rescue by gifting him a kingdom of his own. Karna, in return, had pledged Duryodhana eternal fealty. But Karna the generous could not refuse his mother what she asked of him, so he modified the promise, equivocated, made a small adjustment, took a somewhat altered oath. I promise you this, Karna said to Kunti, you will always have 5 sons. Yudhishthira I will not harm. Bhima will not die by my hand. The twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, will go untouched by me. But Arjuna, him I will make no promises about. I will kill him, or he will kill me. One of us will die. Something altered in the air, and Rahel knew that Esther had come. She didn't turn her head, but a glow spread inside her. He's come, she thought. He's here, with me. Esther settled against a distant pillar, and they sat through the performance like this, separated by the breadth of a Kutambalam, but joined by a story, and the memory of another mother. Perhaps that evening had been a particularly bad one in the heart of darkness. In Ayamanem, the men danced as though they couldn't stop. From Karna Shabadam, Karna's oath, to Duryodhana Vadam, the death of Duryodhana and his brother Dushasana. It was almost 4 a.m. when Bhima hunted down vile Dushasana, the man who had tried to publicly undress the Pandava's wife, Draupadi, after the Kauravas had won her in a game of dice. Draupadi, strangely angry only with the men that won her, not the ones that staked her, has sworn that she will never tie up her hair until it is washed in Dushasana's blood. Bhima has vowed to avenge her honor. Bhima cornered Dushasana in a battlefield already strewn with corpses. For an hour they fenced with each other, traded insults, listed all the wrongs that each had done the other. When the light from the brass lamp began to flicker and die, they called a truce. Bhima poured the oil, Dushasana cleaned the charred wick. Then they went back to war. Their breathless battle spilled out of the Kutambalam and spun around the temple. They chased each other across the compound, twirling the papier-mâché maces. Two men in balloon skirts and balding velvet blouses, vaulting over littered moons and mounds of dung, circling around the hulk of a sleeping elephant. Dushasana full of bravado 1 minute, cringing the next. Bhima toying with him. In the early morning light, Estepan and Rahel watched Bhima fulfill his vow to Draupadi. He clubbed Dushasana to the floor. He pursued every feeble tremor in the dying body with his mace, hammering at it until it was stilled. He continued to kill him long after he was dead. Then, with his bare hands, he tore the body open. He ripped its innards out and stooped to lap blood straight from the bowel of the torn carcass, his crazed eyes peeping over the rim, glittering with rage and hate and mad fulfillment. When he had drunk enough, he stood up, bloody intestines draped around his neck like a scarf, and went to find Draupadi and bathe her hair in fresh blood. He still had about him the aura of rage that even murder could not quell. There was a madness there that morning. It was no performance. Estepan and Rahel recognized it. They had seen its work before, another morning, another stage, another kind of frenzy, with millipedes on the soles of its shoes. The brutal extravagance of this, matched by the savage economy of that. They sat there, quietness and emptiness, frozen 2-egg fossils, with horn bumps that hadn't grown into horns. They sat there, quietness and emptiness, frozen 2-egg fossils, with horn bumps that hadn't grown into horns, separated by the breath of a Kutambalam, trapped in the bog of a story that was and wasn't theirs, that had set out with a semblance of structure and order, then bolted like a frightened horse into anarchy. Kochutomban woke and delicately cracked open his morning coconut. The Katikali men took off their makeup and went home to beat their wives, even Kunti, the soft one with breasts. Outside and around, the little town masquerading as a village stirred and came to life. An old man woke and staggered to the stove to warm his peppered coconut oil. Comrade Pilla, a Yemenem's egg breaker and professional omeletier. Oddly enough, it was he who had introduced the twins to Katakali. Against baby Kochuma's better judgment, it was he who took them, along with Lenin, for all-night performances at the temple, and sat up with them till dawn, explaining the language and gesture of Katakali. Aged 6, they had sat with him through this very story. It was he who had introduced him to Rodra Bhima, crazed, bloodthirsty Bhima in search of death and vengeance. He is searching for the beast that lives in him, Comrade Pilla had told them. Frightened, wide-eyed children, when the ordinarily good-natured Bhima began to bay and snarl. Which beast in particular, Comrade Pilla didn't say. Searching for the man who lives in him was perhaps what he really meant. Because certainly no beast had essayed the boundless, infinitely inventive art of human hatred. No beast can match its range and power. As Esther and Rahel stepped through the temple gateway, Comrade K.N.M. Pilla stepped in, slick from his oil bath. "Oh-ho," he said in his piping voice, "you are here. So still you are interested in your Indian culture. Good, good. Very good." The twins, not rude, not polite, said nothing. They walked home together, he and she, we and us. Chaco had moved out of his room and would sleep in Papachi's study so that Sophie Moll and Margaret Kochuma could have his room. Sophie Moll lay asleep on a little camp cot that had been made up for her next to the big bed. The drone of the slow-sealing fan filled her head. Blue-gray blue eyes snapped open. Awake, alive, alert. For the first time since Joe had died, he was not the first thing that she thought about when she woke up. She looked around the room, not moving, just swiveling her eyeballs. A captured spy in enemy territory, plotting her spectacular escape. On the next bed, Margaret Kochuma was still asleep. She lay on her back with her hands clasped together just below her ribcage. The flesh of her cheeks fell away on either side of her face, making her cheekbones look high and prominent, and pulling her mouth downwards in a mirthless smile that contained just a glimmer of teeth. She had tweezed her once bushy eyebrows into the currently fashionable, pencil-thin arcs that gave her a slightly surprised expression, even in her sleep. The rest of her expressions were growing back in a nascent stubble. On the bedside there was a silver-framed, black-and-white wedding picture of Chaco and Margaret Kochema, taken outside the church in Oxford. It was snowing a little. The first flakes of fresh snow lay on the street and sidewalk. Chaco was dressed like Nehru. He wore a white churidar and a black sherwani. His shoulders were dusted with snow. There was a rose in his buttonhole, and the tip of his handkerchief, folded into a triangle, peeped out of his breast pocket. On his feet he wore polished black Oxfords. He looked as though he was laughing at himself and the way he was dressed, like someone at a fancy dress party. Margaret Kochema wore a long, foaming gown and a cheap tiara on her cropped curly hair. Her veil was lifted off her face. She was as tall as he was. They looked happy, thin and young, scowling with the sun in their eyes. Her thick, dark eyebrows were knitted together and somehow made a lovely contrast to the frothy bridal white. A scowling cloud with eyebrows. Behind them stood a large matronly woman with thick ankles and all the buttons done up on her long overcoat. Margaret Kochema's mother was looking away, out of the photograph, as though she would rather not have been there. Margaret Kochema's father had refused to attend the wedding. He disliked Indians. He thought of them as sly, dishonest people. He couldn't believe that his daughter was marrying one. Margaret Kochema was working as a waitress at a cafe in Oxford when she first met Chaco. Her family lived in London. Her father owned a bakery. Her mother was a milliner's assistant. Margaret Kochema had moved out of her parents' home a year ago for no greater reason than a youthful assertion of independence. In Oxford, she shared a small flat with a friend, another waitress in another cafe. Having made the move, Margaret Kochema found herself becoming exactly the kind of girl her parents wanted her to be. Faced with the real world, she clung nervously to old remembered rules, and had no one but herself to rebel against. So even up at Oxford, other than playing her gramophone a little louder than she was permitted at home, she continued to lead the same small, tight life that she imagined she had escaped. Until Chaco walked into the cafe one morning. He was alone. His rumpled shirt was buttoned up wrong. His shoelaces were untied. His hair, carefully brushed and slicked down in front, stood up in a stiff halo of quills at the back. He looked like an untidy, beatified porcupine. He was tall, and underneath the mess of clothes Margaret Kochema could see that he was well built. He had an amused air about him, and a way of narrowing his eyes as though he was trying to read a faraway sign and had forgotten to bring his glasses. The only sign that a fat man lurked inside him was his shining, happy cheeks. He looked cheerful, as though he was with an imaginary friend whose company he enjoyed. He ordered coffee with that same friendly smile, but without appearing to really notice the tall, bushy-eyebrowed waitress who took his order. Then he asked for fried eggs on toast, more coffee, and strawberry jam. When she returned with his order, he said, as though he was continuing an old conversation, "Have you heard about the man who had twin sons?" "No," she said, setting down his breakfast. For some reason, natural prudence perhaps, and an instinctive reticence with foreigners, she did not evince the keen interest that he seemed to expect from her about the man with twin sons. Chaco didn't seem to mind. A man had twin sons, he told Margaret Kochema, Pete and Stuart. Pete was an optimist, and Stuart was a pessimist. On their 13th birthday, their father gave Stuart an expensive watch, a carpentry set, and a bicycle. Chaco looked up at Margaret Kochema to see if she was listening. And Pete's, the optimist's, room he filled with horse dung. When Stuart opened his presents, he grumbled all morning. He hadn't wanted a carpentry set, he didn't like the watch, and the bicycle had the wrong kind of tires. Margaret Kochema had stopped listening because she was riveted by the curious ritual unfolding on his plate. The toast with jam and fried egg was cut into neat little squares. The de-jammed strawberries were summoned one by one and sliced into delicate pieces. When the father went to Pete's the optimist's room, he couldn't see Pete, but he could hear the sound of frantic shoveling and heavy breathing. Horse dung was flying all over the room. Chaco had begun to shake with silent laughter in anticipation of the end of his joke. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" the father shouted to Pete. Chaco paused before the punchline, laughing up at Margaret Kochma, who was smiling at his plate. A voice came from deep inside the dung. "Well, father," Pete said, "if there's so much shit around, there has to be a pony somewhere." Chaco, holding a fork and knife in each hand, leaned back in his chair in the empty cafe and laughed his high, hiccuping, infectious laugh till the tears poured down his cheeks. Margaret Kochma, who had missed most of the joke, smiled. Then she began to laugh at his laugh. When the owner of the cafe appeared, he saw a customer, not a particularly desirable one, and a waitress, an only averagely desirable one, locked in a spiral of hooting, helpless laughter. Meanwhile, another customer, a regular, had arrived unnoticed and waited to be served. The owner cleaned some already clean glasses, clinking them together noisily, and clattered crockery on the counter to convey his displeasure to Margaret Kochma. She tried to compose herself before she went to take the new order. She stole a glance at Chaco, who looked at her and smiled. It was an insanely friendly smile. He finished his breakfast, paid, and left. That evening, after work, she thought about what had happened and was uncomfortable with herself. She was not usually frivolous, and didn't think it right to have shared such uncontrolled laughter with a complete stranger. It seemed such an overfamiliar, intimate thing to have done. She thought of Chaco's laugh, and a smile stayed in her eyes for a long time. Chaco began to visit the cafe quite often. He always came with his invisible companion and his friendly smile. Even when it wasn't Margaret Kochma who served him, he sought her out with his eyes, and they exchanged secret smiles that invoked the joint memory of their laugh. Margaret Kochma found herself looking forward to the rumpled porcupine's visits, without anxiety, but with a sort of creeping affection. She learned that he was a Rhodes scholar from India, that he read classics, and rode for Balliol. Until the day she married him, she never believed that she would ever consent to be his wife. A few months after they began to go out together, he began to smuggle her into his rooms, where he lived like a helpless, exiled prince. Despite the best efforts of his scout and cleaning lady, his room was always filthy. Books, empty wine bottles, dirty underwear, and cigarette butts littered the floor. Margaret Kochma's tiny, ordered life relinquished itself to this truly baroque bedlam, with the quiet gasp of a warm body entering a chilly sea. She discovered that underneath the aspect of the rumpled porcupine, a tortured Marxist was at war with an impossible, incurable romantic, who forgot the candles, who broke the wine glasses, who lost the ring, who made love to her with a passion that took her breath away. She had always thought of herself as a somewhat uninteresting, thick-waisted, thick-ankled girl, not bad-looking, not special. But when she was with Chaco, old limits were pushed back, horizons expanded. Being with Chaco made Margaret Kochma feel as though her soul had escaped from the narrow confines of her island country into the vast, extravagant spaces of his. In the year she knew him, before they were married, she discovered a little magic in herself, and for a while, like a blithe genie released from her lamp. She was perhaps too young to realize that what she assumed was her love for Chaco was actually a tentative, timorous acceptance of herself. As for Chaco, Margaret Kochma was the first female friend he had ever had, not just the first woman he had slept with, but his first real companion. What Chaco loved most about her was her self-sufficiency. He loved the fact that Margaret Kochma didn't cling to him, that she was uncertain about her feelings for him, that he never knew till the last day whether or not she would marry him. He loved the way she would sit up naked in his bed, her long white back swiveled away from him, look at her watch, and say in her practical way, "Oops, I must be off." He encouraged their differences in opinion, and inwardly rejoiced at her occasional outbursts of exasperation at his decadence. He was grateful to her for not wanting to look after him, for not offering to tidy his room, for not being his cloying mother. He grew to depend on Margaret Kochma for not depending on him. He adored her for not adoring him. Of his family, Margaret Kochma knew very little. He seldom spoke of them. The truth is that in his years at Oxford, Chako rarely thought of them. He had no pressing reasons to stay in touch with his parents. The Rhodes Scholarship was generous. He needed no money. He was deeply in love with his love for Margaret Kochma and had no room in his heart for anyone else. Mamachi wrote to him regularly, with detailed descriptions of her sordid squabbles with her husband and her worries about Amu's future. He hardly ever read a whole letter. Sometimes he never bothered to open them at all. He never wrote back. Even the one time he did return, when he stopped Papachi from hitting Mamachi with a brass vase, and a rocking chair was murdered in the moonlight, he was hardly aware of how stung his father had been, or his mother's redoubled adoration of him, or his young sister's sudden beauty. He came and went in a trance, yearning from the moment he arrived to return to the long-backed white girl who waited for him. The winter after he came down from Balliol, he did badly in his exams, Margaret Kochma and Chako were married, without her family's consent, without his family's knowledge. They decided that he should move into Margaret Kochma's flat, displacing the other waitress in the other cafe, until he found himself a job. The timing of the wedding couldn't have been worse. Along with the pressures of living together came penury. There was no longer any scholarship money, and there was the full rent of the flat to be paid. With the end of his rowing came a sudden, premature middle-age spread. Chako became a fat man, with a body to match his laugh. A year into the marriage, and the charm of Chako's studently sloth wore off for Margaret Kochma. It no longer amused her that while she went to work, the flat remained in the same filthy mess that she had left it in, that he seemed incapable of buttoning up his shirt, knotting his tie, and tying his shoelaces before presenting himself for a job interview. Eventually, Chako got a brief, badly paid assignment with the overseas sales department of the India Tea Board. Hoping that this would lead to other things, Chako and Margaret moved to London, to even smaller, more dismal rooms. Margaret Kochma's parents refused to see her. She had just discovered that she was pregnant when she met Joe. He was an old school friend of her brother's. Joe was a biologist. He was updating the 3rd edition of a dictionary of biology for a small publishing house. Joe was everything that Chako wasn't: steady, solvent, thin. Margaret Kochma found herself drawn towards him like a plant in a dark room towards a wedge of light. When Chako finished his assignment and couldn't find another job, he wrote to Mamachi, telling her of his marriage and asking for money. Mamachi was devastated, but secretly pawned her jewelry and arranged for money to be sent to him in England. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. By the time Sophie Mole was born, Margaret Kochma realized that for herself and her daughter's sake, she had to leave Chako. She asked him for a divorce. Chako returned to India, where he found a job easily. For a few years he taught at the Madras Christian College, and after Papachi died, he returned to Yemenem with his Bharat bottle sealing machine, his Balliol ore, and his broken heart. Mamachi joyfully welcomed him back into her life. She fed him, she sewed for him, she saw to it that there were fresh flowers in his room every day. Chako needed his mother's adoration. Indeed, he demanded it, yet he despised her for it and punished her in secret ways. He began to cultivate his corpulence and general physical dilapidation. If Mamachi had guests, relatives, or perhaps an old friend visiting from Delhi, Chako would appear at her tastefully laid dining table adorned with her exquisite orchid arrangements and best china, and worry an old scab or scratch the large, black, oblong calluses he had cultivated on his elbows. But of all the secret punishments that Chako tormented Mamachi with, the worst and most mortifying of all was when he reminisced about Margaret Kochma. "She traded me in for a better man," he would say to Mamachi, and she would flinch as though he had denigrated her instead of himself. Margaret Kochma wrote regularly, giving Chako news of Sophie Mole. She assured him that Joe made a wonderful, caring father, and that Sophie Mole loved him dearly. Facts that gladdened and saddened Chako in equal measure. Margaret Kochma was happy with Joe, happier perhaps than she would have been had she not had those wild, precarious years with Chako. They wrote to each other frequently, and over the years their relationship matured. For Margaret Kochema, it became a comfortable, committed friendship. For Chaco, it was a way, the only way, of remaining in touch with the mother of his child and the only woman he had ever loved. When Sophie Moll was old enough to go to school, Margaret Kochema enrolled herself in a teacher training course and then got a job as a junior school teacher in Clapham. She was in the staff room when she was told about Joe's accident. For Sophie Moll's sake, if not her own, Margaret Kochema did her best to face the tragedy with equanimity, to pretend to face the tragedy with equanimity. She didn't take time off from her job. She saw to it that Sophie Moll's school routine remained unchanged. Finish your homework, eat your egg. No, we can't not go to school. She concealed her anguish under the brisk, practical mask of a schoolteacher, the stern schoolteacher-shaped hole in the universe, who sometimes slapped. But when Chaco wrote inviting her to Ayaminem, something inside her sighed and sat down. Despite everything that had happened between her and Chaco, there was nobody in the world she would rather spend Christmas with. So eventually, though she knew that her friends and colleagues at the school would think it odd, her running back to her first husband just as soon as the second one had died, Margaret Kochema broke her term deposit and bought 2 airline tickets. London, Bombay, Cochin. She was haunted by that decision for as long as she lived. She took with her to the grave the picture of her little daughter's body laid out on the chaise longue in the drawing-room of the Ayaminem house. Even from a distance, it was obvious that she was dead. Green weed and river grime was woven into her beautiful red-brown hair. Her sunken eyelids were raw, nibbled at by fish. Oh, yes, they do, the deep-swimming fish. They sample everything. Her mauve corduroy pinafore said "Holiday" in a tilting, happy font. She was as wrinkled as a Dobie's thumb from being in water too long. A spongy mermaid who had forgotten how to swim. A silver thimble clenched, for luck, in her little fist. Thimble drinker, coughing cartwheeler. Margaret Kochema never forgave herself for taking Sophie Moll to Ayaminem, for leaving her there alone over the weekend while she and Chaco went to Cochin to confirm their return tickets. It was about 9 a.m. when Mamachi and baby Kochema got news of a white child's body found floating downriver where the Mina child broadens as it approaches the backwaters. Esther and Rahel were still missing. Earlier that morning the children, all 3 of them, hadn't appeared for the morning glass of milk. Baby Kochema and Mamachi thought they might have gone down the river for a swim, which was worrying because it had rained heavily the previous day and a good part of the night. They knew that the river could be dangerous. Baby Kochema sent Kochu Maria to look for them, but she returned without them. In the chaos that ensued after Velya Papan's visit, nobody could remember when they had actually last seen the children. They hadn't been uppermost on anybody's mind. They could have been missing all night. Amu was still locked into her bedroom. Baby Kochema had the keys. She called through the door to ask Amu whether she had any idea where the children might be. She tried to keep the panic out of her voice, make it sound like a casual inquiry. Something crashed against the door. Amu was incoherent with rage and disbelief at what was happening to her, at being locked away like the family lunatic in a medieval household. It was only later, when the world collapsed around them, after Sophie Moll's body was brought to Ayaminem and baby Kochema unlocked her, that Amu sifted through her rage to try to make sense of what had happened. Fear and apprehension forced her to think clearly, and it was only then that she remembered what she had said to her twins when they came to her bedroom door and asked her why she had been locked up, the careless words she hadn't meant. "Because of you," Amu had screamed. "If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. None of this would have happened. I wouldn't be here. I would have been free. I should have dumped you in an orphanage the day you were born. You're the millstones around my neck." She couldn't see them crouched against the door. A surprised puff and a fountain in a love in Tokyo. Bewildered twin ambassadors of God knows what. Their Excellencies Ambassador E. Pelvis and S. Insect. "Just go away," Amu had said. "Why can't you just go away and leave me alone?" So they had. The rain had started early the previous afternoon. Kochu Maria, in a bad mood, for no particular reason, ignored Velyapapan when he arrived at the kitchen door, drenched and shaking. His real eye was bloodshot, and he looked as though he had been drinking. He stood there for 10 minutes waiting to be noticed. When he cleared his throat and asked for Mamachi, Kochu Maria tried to shoo him away, but he wouldn't go. She had a pretty good idea of what it was all about, so eventually she decided it would be best to call Mamachi. When Mamachi arrived in the kitchen, in her petticoat and pale pink dressing gown with rick-rack edging, Velyapapan climbed up the kitchen steps and offered her his mortgaged eye. "What is it?" Mamachi asked, stretching her hand out, thinking perhaps that for some reason Velyapapan was returning the kilo of red rice she had given him that morning. "It's his eye," Kochu Maria said loudly to Mamachi, her own eyes bright with onion tears. By then Mamachi had already touched the glass eye. She recoiled from its slippery hardness, its slimy marbleness. She groped her way to the sink and soaked away the sodden paravan's eye juices. Kochu Maria gave Velyapapan an old kitchen cloth to wipe himself with, and said nothing when he stood on the topmost step, almost inside her touchable kitchen, drying himself, sheltered from the rain by the sloping overhang of the roof. When he was calmer, Velyapapan returned his eye to its rightful socket and began to speak. Mamachi, though annoyed at his drunkenness, wasn't averse to listening to bardic stories about herself and her family's Christian munificence. Nothing prepared her for what she was about to hear. Velyapapan began to cry. Half of him wept. Tears welled up in his real eye and shone on his black cheek. With his other eye he stared stonily ahead. An old paravan, who had seen the walking backwards days, torn between loyalty and love. Then the terror took hold of him and shook the words out of him. He told Mamachi what he had seen. The story of the little boat that crossed the river night after night, and who was in it, skin to skin. They went to Kari Saipa's house, Velyapapan said. The white man's demon had entered them. It was Kari Saipa's revenge for what he, Velyapapan, had done to him. The boat that Esta sat on and Rahel found was tethered to the tree stump next to the steep path that led through the marsh to the abandoned rubber estate. He had seen it there every night, rocking on the water, empty, waiting for the lovers to return. Velyapapan had seen them with his own eye. Others had seen them too. The whole village knew. It was only a matter of time before Mamachi found out. So Velyapapan had come to tell Mamachi himself. As a paravan and a man with mortgaged body parts, he considered it his duty. The lovers, sprung from his loins and hers, his son and her daughter. They had made the unthinkable thinkable and the impossible really happen.